She had delayed, because of the dew-wet grass, in order to put on her overshoes, and when she emerged from the house found her waiting husband absorbed in the wonder of a bursting almond bud. She sent a questing glance across the tall grass, and in and out among the orchard trees. "Where's Wolf?" she asked. "He was here a moment ago." Walt Irvine drew himself away with a jerk from the metaphysics and poetry of the organic miracle of blossom and surveyed the landscape. "He was running a rabbit the last I saw of him." "Wolf! Wolf! Here, Wolf!" she called, as they left the clearing and took the trail that led down through the waxen-belled manzanita jungle to the county road. Irvine thrust between his lips the little finger of each hand and lent to her efforts a shrill whistling. She covered her ears hastily and made a wry grimace. "My, for a poet, delicately attuned and all the rest of it, you can make unlovely noises. My eardrums are pierced. You outwhistle Orpheus." "I was about to say a street Arab," she concluded severely. "Poesy does not prevent one from being practical. At least it doesn't prevent me. Mine is no futility of genius that can't sell gems to the magazines." He assumed a mock extravagance and went on. "I am no attic singer, no ballroom warbler." "And why?" "Because I am practical. Mine is no squalor of song that cannot transmute itself, with proper exchange value, into a flower-crowned cottage, a sweet mountain meadow, a grove of redwoods, an orchard of 37 trees, one long row of blackberries and 2 short rows of strawberries, to say nothing of a quarter of a mile of gurgling brook." "Oh, that all your song transmutations were as successful," she laughed. "Name one that wasn't." "Those 2 beautiful sonnets that you transmuted into the cow that was accounted the worst milker in the township." "She was beautiful," he began. "And here's where beauty and utility fall out," was her reply. "And there's the wolf." From the thicket-covered hillside came a crashing of underbrush, and then, 40 feet above them, on the edge of the sheer wall of rock, appeared a wolf's head and shoulders. His braced forepaws dislodged a pebble, and with sharp-pricked ears and peering eyes he watched the fall of the pebble till it struck at their feet. Then he transferred his gaze, and with open mouth laughed down at them. "You wolf, you. And you blessed wolf." The man and woman called out to him. The ears flattened back and down at the sound, and the head seemed to snuggle under the caress of an invisible hand. They watched him scramble backward into the thicket, then proceeded on their way. Several minutes later, rounding a turn in the trail where the descent was less precipitous, he joined them in the midst of a miniature avalanche of pebbles and loose soil. He was not demonstrative. A pat and a rub around the ears from the man, and a more prolonged caressing from the woman. And he was away down the trail in front of them, gliding effortlessly over the ground in true wolf fashion. In build and coat and brush he was a huge timber wolf. The lie was given to his wolfhood by his color and marking. There the dog unmistakably advertised itself. No wolf was ever colored like him. He was brown, deep brown, red-brown, an orgy of browns. Back and shoulders were a warm brown that paled on the sides and underneath to a yellow that was dingy because of the brown that lingered in it. The white of the throat and paws and the spots over the eyes was dirty because of the persistent and ineradicable brown, while the eyes themselves were twin topazes, golden and brown. The man and woman loved the dog very much. Perhaps this was because it had been such a task to win his love. It had been no easy matter when he first drifted in mysteriously out of nowhere to their little mountain cottage. And this would have been the end of him. So far as Irvine and his wife were concerned, had not Irvine at that particular time been called away into the northern part of the state. Biding along on the train, near to the line between California and Oregon, he chanced to look out of the window and saw his unsociable guest sliding along the wagon road, brown and wolfish. Tired yet tireless, dust-covered and soiled with 200 miles of travel. Now Irvine was a man of impulse, a poet. He got off the train at the next station, bought a piece of meat at a butcher shop, and captured the vagrant on the outskirts of a town. The return trip was made in the baggage car, and so Wolf came a second time to the mountain cottage. Here he was tied up for a week and made love to by the man and woman. But it was very circumspect lovemaking. Remote and alien as a traveler from another planet, he snarled down their soft-spoken love words. He never barked. In all the time they had him, he was never known to bark. To win him became a problem. Irvine liked problems. He had a metal plate made, on which was stamped, "Return to Walt Irvine, Glen Ellen, Sonoma County, California." This was riveted to a collar and strapped about the dog's neck. Then he was turned loose, and promptly, he disappeared. A day later came a telegram from Mendocino County. In 20 hours he had made over 100 miles to the north, and was still going when captured. He came back by Wells Fargo Express, was tied up 3 days, and was loosed on the 4th and lost. This time he gained southern Oregon before he was caught and returned. Always, as soon as he received his liberty, he fled away, and always he fled north. He was possessed of an obsession that drove him north. The homing instinct. Irvine called it, after he had expended the selling price of a sonnet in getting the animal back from northern Oregon. Another time the brown wander succeeded in traversing half the length of California. Mine is all of Oregon utility and most of Washington that can't sell before he was picked up and returned collect. He assumed a mock extravagance, a remarkable thing was the speed with which he traveled, no ballroom warbler, fed up and rested.
And why?
As soon as he was practical, he devoted all his energy to getting over the ground. One from being practical. On the first day's run, he was known to cover as high as 150 miles, genius that can't and after that he would average 100 miles a day. He assumed a mock extravagance. He always arrived back lean I am no and hungry and savage, no ballroom warbler, and always departed fresh and vigorous. Because I am practical. Leaving his way northward, poesy does not prevent one from being practical, being that no one could understand. At least it doesn't prevent me. But at last, after a futile year flight, he accepted the inevitable and elected to remain at the cottage where first he had killed the rabbit and slept by the spring. Even after that, a long time elapsed before the man and woman succeeded in patting him. It was a great victory, for they alone were allowed to put hands on him. He was fastidiously exclusive, and no guest at the cottage ever succeeded in making up to him. A low growl greeted such approach. If anyone had the hardihood to come nearer, the lips lifted, the naked fangs appeared, and the growl became a snarl so terrible and malignant that it awed the stoutest of them, as it likewise awed the farmer's dogs that knew ordinary dog snarling, but had never seen wolf snarling before. He was without antecedents. His history began with Walt and Madge. He had come up from the south, but never a clue did they get of the owner from whom he had evidently fled. Mrs. Johnson, their nearest neighbor and the one who supplied them with milk, proclaimed him a Klondike dog. Her brother was burrowing for frozen pastries in that far country, and so she constituted herself an authority on the subject. But they did not dispute her. There were the tips of Wolf's ears, obviously so severely frozen at some time that they would never quite heal again. Besides, he looked like the photographs of the Alaskan dogs they saw published in magazines and newspapers. They often speculated over his past, and tried to conjure up, from what they had read and heard, what his Northland life had been. That the Northland still drew him, they knew, for at night they sometimes heard him crying softly, and when the north wind blew, and the bite of frost was in the air, great restlessness would come upon him, and he would lift a mournful lament which they knew to be the long wolf howl. Yet he never barked. No provocation was great enough to draw from him that canine cry. Long discussion they had, during the time of winning him, as to whose dog he was. Each claimed him, and each proclaimed loudly any expression of affection made by him. But the man had the better of it at first, chiefly because he was a man. It was patent that Wolf had had no experience with women. He did not understand women. Madge's skirts were something he never quite accepted. The swish of them was enough to set him a-bristle with suspicion, and on a windy day she could not approach him at all. On the other hand, it was Madge who fed him. Also it was she who ruled the kitchen, and it was by her favor and her favor alone, that he was permitted to come within that sacred precinct. It was because of these things that she bade fair to overcome the handicap of her garments. Then it was that Walt put forth special effort, making it a practice to have Wolf lie at his feet while he wrote, and, between petting and talking, losing much time from his work. Walt won in the end, and his victory was most probably due to the fact that he was a man. Though Madge averred that they would have had another quarter of a mile of gurgling brook and at least 2 west winds sighing through their redwoods, had Walt properly devoted his energies to song transmutation and left Wolf alone to exercise a natural taste and an unbiased judgment. "It's about time I heard from those triolets," Walt said, after a silence of 5 minutes, during which they had swung steadily down the trail. "There'll be a check at the post office, I know, and we'll transmute it into beautiful buckwheat flour, a gallon of maple syrup, and a new pair of overshoes for you. And into beautiful milk from Mrs. Johnson's beautiful cow," Madge added. "Tomorrow's the 1st of the month, you know." Walt scowled unconsciously, then his face brightened, and he clapped his hand to his breast pocket. "Never mind. I have here a nice, beautiful, new cow, the best milker in California." "When did you write it?" she demanded eagerly. Then, reproachfully, "And you never showed it to me." "I saved it to read to you on the way to the post office, in a spot remarkably like this one," he answered, indicating, with a wave of his hand, a dry log on which to sit. A tiny stream flowed out of a dense fern brake, slipped down a mossy-lipped stone, and ran across the path at their feet. From the valley arose the mellow song of meadow larks, while about them, in and out, through sunshine and shadow, fluttered great yellow butterflies. Up from below came another sound that broke in upon Walt reading softly from his manuscript. It was a crunching of heavy feet, punctuated now and again by the clattering of a displaced stone. As Walt finished and looked to his wife for approval, a man came into view around the turn of the trail. He was bareheaded and sweaty. With a handkerchief in one hand, he mopped his face, while in the other hand he carried a new hat and a wilted starched collar which he had removed from his neck. He was a well-built man, and his muscles seemed on the point of bursting out of the painfully new and ready-made black clothes he wore. "Warm day," Walt greeted him. Walt believed in country democracy and never missed an opportunity to practice it. The man paused and nodded. "I guess I ain't used much to the warm," he vouchsafed half apologetically. "I'm more accustomed to zero weather." "You don't find any of that in this country," Walt laughed. "Should say not," the man answered. "And I ain't here a-lookin' for it neither. I'm tryin' to find my sister. Meb, you know where she lives. Her name's Johnson, Mrs. William Johnson." "You're not her Klondike brother?" Madge cried, her eyes bright with interest. "About whom we've heard so much?" "Yes'm, that's me," he answered modestly. "My name's Miller, Skiff Miller. I just thought I'd surprise her." "You are on the right track then. Only you've come by the footpath." Madge stood up to direct him, pointing up the canyon a quarter of a mile. "You see that blasted redwood? Take the little trail turning off to the right. It's the shortcut to her house. You can't miss it." "Yes'm, thank you, ma'am," he said. He made tentative efforts to go, but seemed awkwardly rooted to the spot. He was gazing at her with an open admiration of which he was quite unconscious, and which was drowning, along with him, in the rising sea of embarrassment in which he floundered. "We'd like to hear you tell about the Klondike," Madge said. "Mayn't we come over some day while you are at your sister's? Or, better yet, won't you come over and have dinner with us?" "Yes'm, thank you, ma'am," he mumbled mechanically. Then he caught himself up and added, "I ain't stoppin' long. I gotta be pullin' north again. I go out on tonight's train. You see, I've got a mail contract with the government." When Madge had said that it was too bad, he made another futile effort to go. But he could not take his eyes from her face. He forgot his embarrassment in his admiration, and it was her turn to flush and feel uncomfortable. It was at this juncture, when Walt had just decided it was time for him to be saying something to relieve the strain, that Wolf, who had been away nosing through the brush, trotted wolf-like into view. Skiff Miller's abstraction disappeared. The pretty woman before him passed out of his field of vision. He had eyes only for the dog, and a great wonder came into his face. "Well, I'll be hanged," he enunciated slowly and solemnly. He sat down ponderingly on the log, leaving Madge standing. At the sound of his voice, Wolf's ears had flattened down. Then his mouth had opened in a laugh. He trotted slowly up to the stranger and first smelled his hands, then licked them with his tongue. Skiff Miller patted the dog's head and slowly and solemnly repeated, "Well, I'll be hanged." "Excuse me, ma'am," he said the next moment. "I was just surprised some, that was all." "We're surprised, too," she answered lightly. "We never saw Wolf make up to a stranger before." "Is that what you call him, Wolf?" the man asked. Madge nodded. "But I can't understand his friendliness toward you, unless it's because you're from the Klondike. He's a Klondike dog, you know." "Yes'm," Miller said absently. He lifted one of Wolf's forelegs and examined the footpads, pressing them and denting them with his thumb. "Kind of soft," he remarked. "He ain't been on trail for a long time." "I say," Walt broke in, "it is remarkable the way he lets you handle him." Skiff Miller arose, no longer awkward with admiration of Madge, and in a sharp, businesslike manner asked, "How long have you had him?" But just then the dog, squirming and rubbing against the newcomer's legs, opened his mouth and barked. It was an explosive bark, brief and joyous, but a bark. "That's a new one on me," Skiff Miller remarked. Walt and Madge stared at each other. The miracle had happened. Wolf had barked. "It's the first time he ever barked," Madge said. "First time I ever heard him, too," Miller volunteered. Madge smiled at him. The man was evidently a humorist. "Of course," she said, "since you have only seen him for 5 minutes." Skiff Miller looked at her sharply, seeking in her face the guile her words had led him to suspect. "I thought you understood," he said slowly. "I thought you'd tumbled to it from his making up to me. He's my dog. His name ain't Wolf. It's Brown." "Oh, Walt," was Madge's instinctive cry to her husband. Walt was on the defensive at once. "How do you know he's your dog?" he demanded. "Because he is," was the reply. "Mere assertion," Walt said sharply. In his slow and pondering way, Skiff Miller looked at him, then asked, with a nod of his head toward Madge, "How'd you know she's your wife?" "You just say, 'Because she is,' and I'll say it's mere assertion. The dog's mine. I bred him and raised him, and I guess I ought to know. Look here. I'll prove it to you." Skiff Miller turned to the dog. "Brown." His voice rang out sharply, and at the sound the dog's ears flattened down as to a caress. "Gee." The dog made a swinging turn to the right. "Now mush on." And the dog ceased his swing abruptly and started straight ahead, halting obediently at command. "I can do it with whistles," Skiff Miller said proudly. "He was my lead dog." "But you are not going to take him away with you?" Madge asked tremulously. The man nodded. "Back into that awful Klondike world of suffering?" He nodded and added, "Oh, it ain't so bad as all that. Look at me. Pretty healthy specimen, ain't I? But the dogs, the terrible hardship, the heartbreaking toil, the starvation, the frost. Oh, I've read about it and I know. I nearly ate him once, over on Little Fish River," Miller volunteered grimly. "If I hadn't got a moose that day was all that saved him. I'd have died first." Madge cried. "Things is different down here," Miller explained. "You don't have to eat dogs. You think different just about the time you're all in. You've never been all in, so you don't know anything about it.